They told her to disappear. Vanessa Jenkins folded that order the way a seamstress folds a shirt. Clean, precise, no crease left to catch the light. She learned the mathematics of being unseen the way other people learned to breathe. Weight distribution on the balls of her feet, the soft angle of a wrist that never called attention, the way a voice could flatten to background noise so it matched the hum of silverware and the low piano in the corner. Tonight the lobby was a stage of marble and brass. The guests were wealthy statues gilded in evening clothes. The staff moved like the clockwork that made the place look effortless. Her hands were steady as she balanced the tray. Nails short, skin a map of tiny scars. The tray was a shield and a ledger, glasses, a folded menu, an unremarkable white napkin. The hotel expected perfection, and it got Vanessa's practiced silence. She smiled with her eyes and learned to be small enough to pass through the gaps in attention. They called her Jennifer on staff lists. Some of the other waiters called her Jay. Nobody at the front desk knew the whole story. Nobody at the valet had seen the photos on her walls. The more eyes that passed over her without landing, the safer she became. The room smelled of lemon oil and the sea wind moving in off the harbor. The night had a Sicilian light to it, the kind that can make even a polished room look like an open terrace above the water. It was here, in this islandly brightness, that an old woman walked in wrapped in quiet power, leaning on a cane carved with knots as if it had grown from the stories of her hands. She moved with the inevitability of something familiar. The sharp hush that followed her like a scarf pulled tight was not entirely about respect. It was recognition, echoes of a regional gravity none of them could name. Vanessa saw the matriarch before anyone else did. Low shoulders under a heavy coat, eyes that scanned the room as if they carried a ledger of faces. The younger man at her side, dressed in a fit that screamed money, kept his head slightly forward like a hawk. He introduced himself with a smile that read as practiced more than sincere. Cameras blinked, but the matriarch's world spun slower. She took in the chandeliers and the staff, and then let her gaze settle into the thread of the room until it found Vanessa's hands. Vanessa's mouth formed a word she hadn't spoken in 20 years. It wasn't a recitation so much as the memory of voice, an intonation pulled from a lullaby, a kitchen curse, a blessing felt in the bones. It was the kind of sound that belonged in the far corners of an old island church, in the hush between communion and the priest's blessing. For Vanessa, it was not language as information, but language as anchor. When the syllable landed, the room balanced on a hair. A waitress paused mid-step. A couple holding hands found the movement of their fingers oddly weighted. The piano tapered off in a note that refused to settle. Conversation drained from the air. Even the background hiss of the wine glasses seemed to hold its breath. The old woman stopped walking. Her fingers tightened on the cane, and the thin membranous veil of years cleaved for a second, revealing the exact place the word belonged. She said nothing. She only held that look for a long beat, like a woman listening for a song and then humming the first line. It might have been nothing, a tick of the mind, a coincidence, but her eyes did not waver from Vanessa. They softened, then narrowed, then settled into an instrument of recognition. From somewhere back across time, the matriarch pulled a name and let it float like a pebble in water. The ripple reached Vanessa's chest. In the cluster of those who lived in the flash zones of the city, the staff, the sentries, the people who knew the etiquette of remaining unseen, people read this kind of silence like punctuation. It was not always a good sign. "Who is she?" the son asked under his breath. His voice had the careful edge of someone who had never needed to shout to be obeyed. He watched Vanessa like a man watching a bird he might want for the table. The old woman steadied herself, but her hand moved, almost reflexively, toward a pendant beneath her coat. A glint of mother-of-pearl, talismanic and quiet. Her lips made a small shape. Something in the way she said it, an inward sound, an old scar of grammar, made Vanessa's knees feel thinner than they were. The hotel manager's voice cut in, too bright, too managerial. "Table 7 is ready. Please, staff. Discreet service as requested." He meant invisible. He meant no spectacle. Vanessa had been told to disappear. The room had other plans. "Stay with this. What you think you see isn't always what's real." The matriarch asked a question older than the room. It was a practical thing dressed like an aside. "What is that they pass here with the citrus?" Her accent curved the words. It was not the polished Italian of television dramas, but the crookeded grammar of a small seafront town, flavored by salt and centuries. Vanessa's heart answered before her head could caution it to keep silent. She recognized the question as a test, the kind elders use to measure someone by the small things they don't teach in schools. Vanessa positioned the tray so that her hand could move without calling attention. She tasted the memory on her tongue. slices of orange preserved with sugar at religious festivals, thin flatbread smeared with tomato and oil, the bitter velvet of capers preserved in salt. Her adoptive father had called them simple, the kind of things made to coax prayer from a tired mouth. She had learned them in a kitchen where the radio played music in dialect, and the matriarch of that house hummed along to the same old melodies Vanessa now heard in the old woman's eyes. "There is a plate of citrus and anchovies," Vanessa said, not translating, but offering a name in a register she had not used with outsiders. The word she chose had more the texture of bread-soft vowels than anything else. It landed small and sure. The matriarch's hand stilled. For a heartbeat she looked like someone whose weather had changed and who, in reflex, reached for her coat. Her face altered in a way that stopped the son mid-sip. He blinked once and then twice, and a thin line of curiosity, quickly armored, crossed his jaw. "Bring her to the private table," the matriarch said then, the command the room had been waiting for. It was not a request so much as an acknowledgement of an uninvited truth. A staffer went to call the kitchen, an errand that should have been routine but carried the electric feel of a wrong chord. Vanessa, named Jennifer on tonight's roster, Vanessa in the parts of her life she kept folded away, did not move as if summoned. She moved because a canal opened in the floorboards, and her feet followed the route built into her memory. She slid through the room like a shadow slipping between spokes. They guided her to the private table in the back, a space that smelled of lemon oil and lemon peel, a place with curtains drawn against the harbor wind. The matriarch sat at the head of the table, a small island of old authority in a sea of polished youth. The son did not smile. He watched Vanessa like the beginnings of a threat might show up in posture rather than policy. He made small notes with his eyes. Vanessa felt them, sharp as pinpricks. "How long have you—" the matriarch began, and then paused as she measured the trust needed to finish. "How long have you been away from home?" Vanessa thought of the first kitchen that had taken her in, an aunt of a friend who'd found her at 13 sleeping at a bus stop, wild with the city and hungry for belonging. She thought too of a man who had kept an eye on her when she ate scarfed slices of bread behind the laundry room. He had taught her to grease pans, to read the angles of a room, to be small on purpose. He'd loaded languages into her like ballast, a smattering of the dialect, because the old woman sometimes needed to hear it in the middle of a meal. He'd never asked for anything in return. "Long enough to know the taste of good oranges," Vanessa said. She kept her voice low. She kept nothing more. The matriarch closed her eyes like a woman saying the name of someone dead. Her fingers brushed the pendant. "You are not from here," she said finally. The son looked at her, puzzled, cautious. "But your voice carries the island. That voice will not leave once it has been sewn into the soul." Vanessa's chest thrummed. She was a waitress with a hidden ledger, a woman who had made a career of passing through rooms others thought they owned. She had not expected to be plucked into a family sitting at a private table, but the matriarch's recognition changed the geometry of the room. Suddenly Vanessa was no longer a background action. She was a hinge. The private dinner began, servers moving like tides, plates wheeled in, and the hush that comes when people sense a private drama unfolding. The son asked questions that were professional in tone and personal at the edges. Where had she come from? Who had taught her to move like that? Had she any family? Vanessa supplied measured facts. She spoke of work, of traveling between kitchens, of sleeping in 3 different neighborhoods in the last year. She kept her answers thin as a crepe. The rest she wrapped like paper around a present she would not open in public. The matriarch watched her hands as much as her face. At one point she reached down and drew back a corner of Vanessa's apron. In the fold was a small stitch, an old mark, a pattern in thread, one that made the matriarch's mouth move in a small, private way. The son noticed it too and leaned in, his curiosity now sharpened with the edge of suspicion. "This stitch," the old woman said softly, as if confessing a prayer. "My sister used to stitch like that, the kind of stitch you used when someone was learning to hide money in hems." The room paused along the seam of that sentence. For Vanessa, the stitch was not evidence of family, but of a pattern, a marker of places where someone had taught a child to hold secrets close to the skin. She had stitched it herself once, late at night, to keep a safe place for a note that would never be needed again. The act had been practical and anonymous. The meaning of it shared a room with memory. "She will serve," the son said at last, voice measured, "but she stays within sight." The matriarch inclined her head like a queen setting a piece on a board. "Not as a servant," she corrected. "As company." There was a charm to that, an accidental kindness from a woman who had spent years building fences where none were asked for. Vanessa accepted the assignment because not accepting would be a different kind of risk. She took her place at the edge of the table like a shape that might be filled in later. The private room smelled of citrus and older things. Talc, worn leather, perfume that had been dipped in black tea. The candles were low. The electric light tried to pretend it was flame. A waiter brought a tray, and Vanessa took it. Her hands never stopped being a ledger. The matriarch sipped a slow, heavy wine. The son toyed with a glass, turning it lightly by the stem. They spoke of business in measured tones, and when the talk slid toward the city's docks and certain business deals, Vanessa felt heat bloom under her collar, interest at the edges, not aimed at her but around it. She kept her distance until the moment something in the room changed. It was almost a non-event, a clink that landed wrong, a candle that flared for a second too bright. Then a soft sound like dry leaves shifting filled the private room. It came from somewhere beyond the curtains, a sound that had no right to be in a guarded place. A muffled thud, a pause, a silence so unnatural it cracked. Vanessa's training did the rest. She had been a watched thing for years. She had practiced being invisible and visible with equal efficiency. Her eyes catalogued exits, measured distances, noted the angle of the windows. She saw the waiter by the door go rigid, the maitre to swallow and force a laugh that died without finding breath. The shot came like a cut. It was not the roar of a gun in a movie. It was a thin, intimate punctuation, a sound that unspooled memory faster than pain. A glass shattered, plates scattered like small clumsy wings. The old woman's chair hit the floor with a soft, sick sound. For a beat, everything slowed. The son's face went slack. The staff clustered at the edge of the table. The private room bloomed with the metallic smell that follows blood. Vanessa moved before she thought. Instinct was a language she'd learned when there were no legal paths left to safety. She lunged, placing her own body between the old woman and the trajectory of violence. Her tray flashed up like a shield. The glass sliced through air and a shard thudded into the velvet of the matriarch's coat, where a bullet would have passed. A second shot thudded into a lamp. Gunfire that should have screamed was swallowed by the walls. They had been built to muffle and to preserve. But for those in the room it resounded like a prophecy. People screamed. Staff hit the floor or dove for cover, their training collapsing into terror. The son reached for something at his belt, an instinct that hung between a private arsenal and control. A man from behind the curtains lunged with a small, blunted weapon. Vanessa stepped, using the tray as leverage and weight, striking him across the forearm. The movement was clean and ugly, honed by necessity. He fell back, coughing. Somewhere outside, beyond the curtains, in the corridors, by the valet, other noises converged. Boots, a shout, the scrape of something heavy. Whoever had planned the attack had done so with internal knowledge. Cameras hit, guards misdirected, a rhythm that might have suggested expediency rather than a chaotic break-in. And yet their timing had been off. Vanessa dragged the matriarch toward the service door, the wooden cane clattering. She tore the heavy curtain aside and moved through the back of house the way a ghost knows the blueprint of a house it's never lived in. The service corridors were narrower, lit by fluorescent tubes that ate colors and left everything too white. Here, the staff moved like a separate species, trained as Vanessa had been in the geometry of invisibility. They knew the crawl spaces, the dumb waiters that could swallow a plate and disappear, the locked cupboards that stored more than linens. They cut through the kitchen like a river finding its bed. A man lunged from the shadows, security by the look of his uniform, but the badge he wore clinked like a lie. Vanessa grabbed him by the collar and threw him against a steel prep table. He fell and the impact sent a tray clattering. Someone else reached at the knockout. She thrust the tray between herself and an arm. Her fingers, small and tough, found the angle of the wrist and twisted until the man's hand opened. The movement was not theatrical. It was the language of survival. They made it out the goods elevator where the city smelled like salt and gasoline and the late-night detritus that clings to docks. Outside, the harbor wind hit Vanessa like a slap. The matriarch crouched with a hand to her chest. Her eyes, once proud and calm, now flicked around with something like fear. The son stood by the elevator, the rigid armor of privilege stripped away to reveal the raw human kernel, reckless and quick to act. "Who's responsible?" he demanded. "Who did this?" Vanessa did not have a name ready. She had a ledger and a map and a folder full of paper that said things in a way cameras and collars could not. She had been hunting a network for 10 years, roots, wallets, whispers from survivors who made a life in the seams. She had followed the money the way a detective follows footprints in snow, but her breadcrumbs had been left behind counterfeits, private leads, the testimonies of people scared into silence. Tonight's attack shifted the pattern into one more dangerous note. "We were set up," she said. Her voice was thin with adrenaline. This was internal. The son looked at her as if new geometry had been added to the problem. He had always suspected traitors in the rooms beneath him. The thought that the betrayal might be from within his own orbit landed like a stone. He wanted a bullet to plug into that traitor's head, but terror and calculation warred in his face. They retreated to a car that moved like a shadow, a vehicle that could hold a person and also be mistaken for a benevolent delivery. Vanessa rode with the matriarch pressed close like a secret. The old woman gripped her cane with a hand that shook. The scent of citrus in the private room now belonged to a memory Vanessa could not displace. When they reached the safe apartment, a place Vanessa used sometimes, a small unit above a shuttered bodega with a view of the back alleys, Vanessa let the door fall and turned the lock like someone closing an old wound. She flicked the lights on, and for a moment the room felt like a confession. Maps plastered on the wall, yellow pins in a constellation pattern, photographs with faces blurred where anonymity was still a kindness. Strings ran between notes and ledger entries. There were bank records, printouts of transfers, the soft paper of testimonies photocopied in thick toner. An old radio hummed in the corner. The matriarch sat like a stone, eyeing the wall. The son paced, restless, hands in his pockets. Vanessa moved to the table and began to lay it out the way sailors lay out charts. She did not like theatrics, but here the things had to be made visible. She tapped a line of transfers that led across the city, and then out to the islands. She showed the son a spreadsheet where a number flagged repeated withdrawals linked to shell accounts. She pulled up witness statements, people who had been moved like inventory, their stories clipped and raw and full of fright. She had their names secured in police advocates' hands, phone logs that mapped nights like constellations, ledger entries that had been smudged but not erased. Internal compliance gave them access, she said. Her voice was flat. Someone opened the camera feeds. Someone redirected security shifts. The son snapped his fingers. Who? Vanessa held up her hand. She had a list of suspects, a ring of probable hands, but naming them meant nothing without proof. Names could be bullets, or they could be breadcrumbs. She preferred paper. Look here, she said, pointing to a bank transfer that moved funds through 3 countries in a single night. Small entries, a test pattern, then larger orders when things needed to be shifted. They used the trafficking lines to launder money. People were moved as freight. Some survivors got out and told what they could. Most couldn't. The attack tonight, it's the same pattern. They knew our schedules. They knew where to aim to make it look like the matriarch had enemies at the gate, not inside. The son swallowed. He'd been raised to believe the family had clean channels, bloodlines and loyalties that could be trusted. He had run nights and had seen the underbelly once or twice. But what Vanessa unfurled in the light of that shabby apartment looked like a house with termites. The matriarch's cane left a groove in the couch as she leaned back. "You've gathered this how?" the son asked, but the question had a different weight to it now. It was less curiosity and more accusation. Vanessa hesitated. She had been cultivated as unseen labor for a decade. She had worn aprons and served wine and listened. Her intelligence came from the places the powerful exhaled and thought no one would catch the scent. Whispers at the dockworkers' stands, a thrown napkin with a scribbled name, the soft, guilty language of men who did not expect the room to remember them. "I move where others can't," she said. "I work their tables. I hear their offhand comments and I keep them. I trade plates for memories." Her mouth tilted, almost a smile that had no joy to it. "You can't see what doesn't want to be seen." The matriarch's eyes glowed like coals. For a woman who had risen by keeping her own counsel close, the idea of a person undercover within the rooms of the city was both a comfort and an affront. "You have pictures," the son said. He pointed to an envelope Vanessa had opened. Tucked inside were faces that had been blurred until a blink scraped the screen. "This proves trafficking? These are witnesses saying what?" "They're survivors," Vanessa said. "They speak, but they risk everything to talk. Some names are code. Some lives have been traded like inventory. It's messy, it's criminal, but it's there." The matriarch listened, her hand moving to the pendant. "Your protector," she said at last, voice small. Was he from this side of the sea?" A wash of memory came hot behind Vanessa's eyes. Her protector's voice, The kitchen light that always seemed to be the right temperature, the way he would hum monstrous love songs to the radio. He had been a man who carried stories about an island and about women who had survived worse. He had sewed the stitch Vanessa now had hidden under her apron, and when the time came, he had given her a name and a direction before he vanished. Vanessa had never known the man's full name. She had pages of notes written in a hand that slanted backward. "People keep pieces of us," she said. "He kept this for me." She opened her palm and revealed a small scrap of thread, red and faded, the same pattern the matriarch had recognized in the kitchen that night. "I kept it in case I needed to prove I wasn't a ghost." The matriarch touched the thread with the gentleness of someone remembering a child's pulse. Her eyes filled just a little. She had built a fortress of power, and she kept grief behind different doors. Now grief and suspicion met in the same hallway. "You've done this alone," she said at last. It was not a question. It was an acknowledgement that both terrified and relieved her. "This city choose the brave." "Not alone," Vanessa corrected. "I work with people who can't be seen. Survivors. A few contacts that—" She stopped. She had reached the limit of what she could disclose in this clutter of urgency. Her mind ran a ledger, evidence, allies, missing people who could light a trail if they dared speak to the right voice in the right way. "I have evidence they can't refute. Financial trails, shipping manifests, witness statements, enough to make a case if it goes to the right place." The son sat down hard in a chair and rubbed his forehead. The world he had been trained to navigate by force and favor now required a procedural language he found distasteful. Subpoenas, legal teams, police that could be bought if you didn't guard them, courts that slept in the pockets of men who liked the world quiet. The old woman's world had been built on different currencies, oaths and fear and loyalty. Now those currencies were falling like coins from a burned ledger. You could kill your enemies and reduce problems immediately, or you could collect evidence and build a net that would not hold one hand, but many. The matriarch had lived long enough to know the difference between a single bullet and a case file that unraveled an entire system. "You want me to believe you," the matriarch said, "that you will turn this—" She pulled a face at the word like plucking a frog, "into law." Vanessa felt the weight of choice settle into her shoulders, heavier than any tray. For 10 years she'd wanted something that was not quite vengeance and not quite justice, an exorcism of the way human beings could be moved like chess pieces. Here, in a dingy safe apartment with maps sticking out from the walls like the wings of pinned insects, she had the opportunity to change the frame. "I want the survivors safe," she said. "I want there to be witnesses who don't die if someone else in this city makes a decision. I want the people who did this to be exposed in a way that follows them across borders. I don't want revenge disguised as righteousness. I want the law, if the law can be made to listen." The matriarch's eyes narrowed. She had seen men like Vanessa and taken them into the family fold sometimes, offering sanctuary in ways that cost the family little and bought them much. She had also seen women like her used as tools and discarded. The offer she was considering was complicated by years of doing things the old way. The son, younger by decades, had not the patience of slow justice. He had weapons and lists and a roster of people who would do anything asked. But the son also knew the weather of modern investigations, digital traces, international banks, people who could be bought out of jail, if the case could be made visible enough to survive. "You're proposing we hand this to others?" he asked. "Lawmakers? Courts?" Vanessa shrugged. "We hand it to someone who can bring a net that reaches beyond the city. The more public this goes, the less it is a thing you can bury with a check." Silence settled. Outside the apartment a siren wailed and then faded into the night. In the room, 3 people sat amid the map and the thread and the coffee-stained notes of a decade's work, feeling the tilt of a world that had just been turned. The matriarch tapped her cane against the floor. Her voice came slow and precise. "You risk your life. You risk these people's faces. You step into a light that cannot be hidden." Why? Vanessa thought of a child at a market who had been traded for a debt, a woman who had wept into a bedsheet until she was dry and hollow. She thought of the man who had taught her the stitch and vanished, leaving her with fragments and the promise that stitched things would know each other. She thought of being small and invisible because the world refused to look twice. "Because someone has to look," she said. "Because if I don't, no one else will." The matriarch looked at the son. The son looked at Vanessa. For the first time since they'd sat down, they considered a shared ledger. "All right," the matriarch said finally. "We listen. We test you. But you must understand this. If you are working with people who would sacrifice our name to save themselves, I will not be spared the cost. You must have proof." Vanessa nodded. Proof. The word carried the weight of years. She felt the room shrink and enlarge in the same breath. A family that had once been an enemy offering the outline of a table at which she might sit. A woman younger than the matriarch offering resources, as if they were actors in a play that was suddenly plausible. "Show me the evidence," the son said. "If it's enough, we'll open channels, but I make no promises." Vanessa pulled a file from the stack, a thin stack of printouts with numbers and the names of accounts, and one taped-in photo of a man who'd been a driver and who had died in a way that didn't look accidental. She watched the son take it and let the paper move between his fingers like an accusation. "You called my family out," he said quietly, as if the accusation and the confession were the same thing. "I called out who used family as passbooks," Vanessa replied. "The suspect list includes people from every house in this city. Some are named in your ledgers, some are not." The matriarch's hand went to the pendant again. She rolled it between two fingers and breathed a long breath like someone drawing a net tight. The old woman's face felt suddenly like the surface of a coin, readable, cold, tested by time. "Rest tonight," she said. "We will decide who to trust in daylight." Vanessa slumped against the kitchen counter for a second, letting the adrenaline collect in her bones. The sun stood by the window looking out to the harbor, where lights blinked like a promise. The matriarch watched Vanessa not as a servant now, but as a potential ally, or a dangerous loose end. That uncertainty clenched Vanessa in the way things do, that are still unfinished. She had wanted recognition, and found it. But recognition came with strings, alliances, obligations, and the moral weight of what you do with the knowledge you hold. She had come into a family seat by accident, and left with a ledger that might topple empires. In the apartment's harsh light, the maps on the walls looked like a battlefield and a blueprint at once. A decision hovered in the room like a fruit waiting to fall. It would be made tomorrow, when the city was sharper in the light. For now, there were stitches to be mended, and proofs to be refined, and a body to hide under blankets until dawn. Vanessa walked to the window and looked out at the harbor. Her reflection stood there in the glass, a woman who had been taught to be small, and who had spent years trading invisibility for information. The pendant the matriarch had fingered flashed in the memory of her mind, something that belonged to a past she had thought lost. The city breathed below. Somewhere a bell marked the hour. Vanessa allowed herself the smallest of permissions, to be tired, to be seen, to be afraid. Then she took the maps down from the wall and began to reorganize the pins by color, as if assigning each threat a place on the map might make it less hungry. There was a knock at the door. Soft, professional, the kind of knock that belonged to an official with a reason. Vanessa opened it a crack. A courier stood there with an envelope sealed in wax and a note written in a hand she recognized not by sight, but by its care. It was a single sentence stitched into paper like a tiny compass. "We are watching," it said. Vanessa read it twice. The city had just rearranged its chess pieces. Her throat tightened. The matriarch's voice behind her was a low instrument. "You wanted to bring justice into this room," she said. "Very well, but know this. When the streets open and the law walks through our doors, everyone will see who stands in the light and who is hidden in the dark." Vanessa folded the note and tucked it into the lining of her pocket. She had always known being visible had a cost. The question that would shape the days ahead was not whether she wanted to be seen, but who would be watching when she finally opened her hands. She folded the sealed note into the pocket of her apron the way she folded any small threat, neatly, so it would not crumple the life it contained. Outside, the harbor kept its steady breath, tugs pulling at mooring lines, the distant clack of containers shifting. A gull that had learned to grin at dumpster tides. Inside the safe apartment, the matriarch touched the pendant again, and the son paced like someone rehearsing moves on a board he'd never expected to see. They did not sleep. They planned. By dawn, the city had the kind of light that scoured faces into details and refused the quick comforts of shadow. Vanessa watched Marco, the son, sweep away his own panic with the mechanical competence of a man brought up to take what needed taking. He dressed as if to meet a board rather than a battleground, a crisp shirt, a jacket that hung with the economy of purpose. Rosa, who had the air of someone whose opinions outlived trends, accepted coffee with the slow gratitude of a woman who had learned to measure time by the people at the table. They began with trust in quarter measures, because trust had to be paid for with proof. Vanessa spread the files out again. They smelled of toner and the faint salt of the harbor. The night's adrenaline had left the edges of every page crisp. "You need official teeth," Marco said, tapping a line of transfers. "Financial freezes, subpoenas, someone in power who isn't owned." Vanessa nodded. "I have an ally," she said. "Not in the city, someone who takes the politics and leaves the paperwork. She'll need convincing, but she acts when the facts are laid out." Rosa leaned forward, the pendant catching the morning like a coin. "Then we don't waste time. We'll build the case you couldn't get to without being inside." They moved like surgeons. Marco used family access to open channels he had always kept closed to polite inquiry. Vanessa used the street, a network of people who had owed her small favors, a courier who had once slipped her a watch piece and expected nothing, a bartender who left the same brand of coffee where everyone could see it, and only those who needed directions to the next step would find them. Vanessa made one phone call, short and precise. Elena Moretti answered as if she had been expecting the call, which she had not. Vanessa had never spoken to Elena in her life, but Elena had a reputation the city used like a warning. She was a state prosecutor with a spine that did not bend with envelopes and a history of taking ship owners and small-time kings to court. People whispered her name the way priests whispered saints. When Vanessa arranged to meet, she came with the slow radiance of someone who had been undermined and had decided she had had enough. She handled the evidence with the care of someone who had seen fragile things break under the weight of a badly asked question. Elena did not ask how Vanessa had gathered these pieces. She did not need to. She asked what Vanessa wanted done. "Expose the network," Vanessa said. "Protect the people who will talk, and make the money traceable so it can't be hidden behind shell doors." Elena put a folder on the table, and the clip sounded like a small verdict. "This would take a coalition," she said. "International banks, witness protection, time, and a judge who will not sell his bench. But it's possible. If your evidence holds up, and if those witnesses will talk within our system, we can move." Vanessa's jaw tightened. Moving meant time, and time could be a hand that disrobed the living. "Make it possible," she said. "And make sure those witnesses walk away in cars that don't know our faces." Elena nodded. "I'll open channels," she said. "But we will need more than bank transfers. We will need affidavits, corroboration, someone willing to tie the man who orchestrates shipments to ledgers and to movement orders. That takes people who can risk being seen." That night they assembled a small cabinet of risk. Marco, who could navigate the household ledgers and the family accounts. Rosa, who knew which old alliances might yet keep a secret. Elena, with the authority of the state. And Vanessa, who held the city's quiet corners in a palm she had learned to keep steady. On the periphery there were others. A dock worker who had seen a crate unloaded and felt wrong about the weight. A nurse who had treated a woman with the same brand of bruises and had kept her name. A courier who had watched a manifest change names overnight. They fractured the problem into lines they could pursue: financial, logistical, testimonial. They would freeze assets as they were identified. They would create a ring of safety for survivors willing to testify. And they would stage a sting, a lure to draw the rival known in the files as Corvino into the light. Salvatore Corvino. When Vanessa said the name, it tasted of rusted metal and 2 clean suits. He had built a reach out of private ports and lawyers who liked their accounts complex. He had a network the city described in hummed rumors. Some said he moved art, others said he moved people. Vanessa's papers said both. He had always been careful, or he had been until someone left a track. "Corvino trusts patterns," Marco said. "He prefers the bay at night and back rooms with locked doors. If his money moves like an ocean current, it will leave eddies we can follow." The plan took shape like a map. Pressure on the financial rails to make him adjust. An invitation he could not refuse to a private club where he liked to posture. And, most risky, a live bait of testimony. Elena warned that bait had to be handled with the precision of a scalpel. It could not taste like entrapment, because that would ruin a trial and hand Corvino the legal victories. Vanessa understood bait as craft more than trick. The lure had to be true, and it had to be framed so that when Corvino bit, the net would be firm enough to hold him and everyone who protected him. They prepared the witnesses, mostly women who had been moved across borders and given different names. Elena's team put them in a safe house with counselors, slowly unspooling their stories into affidavits that matched ledgers Vanessa had already unearthed. Vanessa spent long hours with them, not as an officer, but as someone who had once been as small and frightened as they were. She listened, which was itself a kind of labor, and she made sure each person felt the dignity of being believed. One evening, as they shuffled through statements, the matriarch arrived at the safe house without fanfare. Rosa carried wrapped food and the stubborn pride of someone who wanted to give what she could without asking for a headline. She sat quietly and sometimes hummed a line of an old song that had lived in no radio in decades. The survivors touched the air around her and found it warm. For all the family's history, Rosa could be gentle in ways she had not been taught to show the world. "You've given me a name," Rosa said to Vanessa, in a tone that was more a promise than praise. "Now give them something beyond words. Make sure they have a place to begin." Vanessa thought of the man who had taught her the stitch and then left. "Angelo," she sometimes whispered in private, though there had been no confirmation that he had even left by choice. She thought of the market child traded for debt, the driver whose funeral had eaten the last of a family's dignity. She thought of the ledger and how money could make grief a commodity. "We build them a path," she said, "not just a witness box." They compiled their case and padded it with what Elena called bulwarks. Bank logs that tied wire transfers to shipping manifests, phone trees that showed coordination across midnight shifts, and testimony placed in the mouth of people who had nothing to gain from lies. They worked in secrecy and in a public theater of mundane legal steps, filings, motions, requests. Corvino's people were slippery but not infallible. They had habits of arrogance, the kind that made them petty in some places where it should have made them cautious. The lure had to be irresistible and credible. Corvino loved the club known as Lido Nero, a private room lit low, walls padded with the kind of fabric that swallowed conversations. It was a place where men like him traded favors with men who had no scruples about making their money disappear. Vanessa had worked there before, wearing an apron and a smile she kept in a drawer. She knew the menus, the angles, the way curtains swallowed sound. Elena arranged for a legal pretext, a quiet charity gala, ostensibly for shipping families displaced by the storm that had hit the regional fishing towns the month prior. The gala's ledger would be clean in the visible books, but beneath it would be a thread that Corvino might find useful, an opportunity to broker a transport that could make one of his shipments look like humanitarian aid. The ruse was delicate. They had to make it look possible without actually facilitating anything illegal. Law and ethics braided in a way that made Elena's jaw set. Vanessa was to be the unseen center. She would work the night, serve Corvino if he came, and watch how his men behaved. But this time, she would no longer be purely invisible. She would carry a camera hidden in a pendant, a discreet recorder, and an affidavit that Elena would swear would accept in court. She would be a bridge between the quiet of service and the public brutality of law. The night came and Lido Nero smelled of citrus and a perfume that was too expensive for its own privacy. Men came with their pockets heavy and their smiles light. Women appeared in dresses that cut lights into shapes. Vanessa moved through it all like a current in glass. She served, she listened, she collected. Her hands never trembled. Under her blouse, her heart did what hearts do when they hold a story too long. It kept time. Corvino arrived like weather. He was careful in his gait and light in his conversation. He sat at a table slightly apart, a ring of men who were watchful and whose faces Vanessa had seen in photographs as a child reading papers she shouldn't have touched. He had a voice that could sound fatherly when it suited him, and ruthless when it did not. Vanessa kept her tray steady as she walked the room, the pendant's camera catching pieces of conversation like moths in a net. He did not take the bait immediately. He almost never did. That was part of why Elena had been patient. Corvino measured people by the confidence they showed in waiting. But that night his men brought him a promise, a shipment that would move a container under the cover of charity, a logistical favor that would benefit both parties. They used a name that matched one of Vanessa's ledger entries, a shell company whose signature had been flagged in the transfers. Vanessa felt it. A change in Corvino's mood, a flicker of danger in the way he tilted his head. The men around him laughed softly at a joke that landed for no one else. Vanessa crossed the room to clear an empty plate, and when she turned, she saw the way Corvino's eyes settled on the pendant. It was a simple moment of recognition, the kind you get when a person who reads surfaces sees a detail that doesn't belong. He motioned to a man, a shadow that slid between tables. He spoke a name. Names were how Corvino counted favors. It was a dangerous turn of the tide. Vanessa did not give panic time to grow. She moved with purpose, her steps rehearsed by countless nights of pretending not to notice. She delivered a plate, smiled in the right place, and watched the room like a conductor listening for a missed cue. She knew a man in the corner was scribbling numbers into a napkin he would never remember. She knew the way two glasses had slightly different lipstick that could tell a story. Small things, collected, became a case. When the man who had been watching Vanessa's pendant slipped away, Vanessa followed, a shadow within a shadow. Corvino's constellation of men arranged themselves around him like satellites. They met in a back room that smelled of old smoke and varnish. The light there was made for secrets. Vanessa pressed herself against the wall and listened. They spoke of shipments and a promised route that matched the ledger. They spoke of an inside man who would open the club's private door, a guard who had been paid with a promise of a quiet life. They laughed about the Matriarch's family as if it was a novelty, not a house that could be cut. Vanessa pressed her palm against the wall and felt for the pulse of the place. It was the city's pulse, and it was steady enough to know that a change was coming. She thumbed the pendant discreetly. The camera caught the men's faces, the joke, the lull of confidence that comes when people believe themselves untouchable. Corvino's voice softened with a plan. A meeting the next week at a warehouse on the far pier, an exchange that would make certain funds appear as charitable. He named the courier. He named the man with the uniform. Vanessa's body prepared itself to become an instrument. She had learned that the city rewards the person who can make the leap from seeing to doing. She slipped back to the visibly lit room and resumed her place among the plates, as if she had stepped out for a breath and returned. Elena's team moved at once, an elegant, ugly machine with warrants and a jurisdictional heat map. They froze accounts where the law would let them. They sent quiet queries to partners abroad. Marco used the family's channels to put pressure on one of the less squeamish bankers. The bank put a flag and the transfer stalled. Corvino did not react with violence at first. He reacted with calculation. He tried to reroute. He ordered an acceleration of shipments and a different channel. But the pattern Vanessa had uncovered left him little room. Funds rerouted into accounts that had been frozen. The shipment that would have looked like aid stalled at a port because a container had been flagged and held. Corvino tasted the claustrophobia of a man whose world suddenly had fewer rails to run on. He lashed out with bluster. He sent threats made to sound like courtesy. He had people find the courier and quiet him with conversations that were not calming. But the net was still closing. Lawyers across borders found their letters. Sailors refused to touch a manifest that could end careers. In the small legal theaters where Elena moved, the case gathered weight. Corvino chose to move anyway, not because he was desperate, but because he, like many men of his class, believed he could test the law and find a seam. He called the warehouse. He expected darkness, certainty, the muscle of men who had long traded in people like a currency. What he did not expect was being led into a theater lit for evidence. The night of the sting, Vanessa returned to the club as if to serve again. Her apron was ironed, her hands were steady. The pendant under her collar had a phrase cut into its casing so tiny it might have been jewelry. She wore a scarf Rosa had given her, an old thing that smelled faintly of lemon, and of a kitchen that had once fed a child who had no papers. It had the stitch she recognized, the same pattern that had led Rosa's eyes to Vanessa in the private room weeks earlier. When Corvino arrived, he was flanked by the same men who had laughed at the club. He moved through the private room like a man who had made his own gravity. He expected the shipment to be invisible, and the law to be polite. He had underestimated two things: the reach of paperwork and the will of people who had nothing left to lose. Vanessa watched him approach the table where the charity conversation was set up. She saw his hands gesture, the way he counted people in the room as if they were chess pieces. Elena's team sat in quiet cars nearby, their microphones light as breath. Marco monitored the family's back channels and sent a string of discreet confirmations to people who owed him little but who were willing to help when presented with the right coin, a ledger, a favor to be repaid. The meeting at the warehouse had been a fabrication to lure Corvino to a place where the law could confront him with the movement of money and the names attached to it. It would only work if people he trusted were present to match the ledgers, and if the people who had been moved had the courage to speak before a camera. That courage had been earned over weeks of care and promises that were not empty. When Corvino realized the shipment would not sail, he smiled, the kind of smile that seeks to coldly contain panic. He began to name names, certain he could trade men for money. He had learned to see people as transactions. He had not learned to see them as witnesses. Vanessa was present when he tried to bargain, when he tried to convert the room into the kind of place where deals erased consequences. She stepped forward when the moment was right, not as muscle, but as witness. She caught his eye and let a line of what she knew pass into his face, evidence of his men on recorded calls, a manifest with his signature on a route that matched payments to a shell company, testimony tucked into private affidavits. "You're in the wrong room, Salvatore," she said quietly. The words were not for dramatic effect, so much as for a man who needed to be told he was being watched. Her hand was steady. She did not reach for a weapon. The law reached instead. Officers poured from cars, a steady legal net that was clean in its brutality. There were arrests as if a curtain had been called. Men fell into compliance when told they were on tape. Corvino fought like a man surprised to find he could be caged by pieces of paper. He had been careful for years, enough that the modern machinery of law found it messy to untangle him. He tried to pay his way out, to invoke favors, to remind people of old debts. But Elena had less willingness to be bribed, and more willingness to name names. The net tightened around him and his circle. There was a moment when Corvino looked directly at Vanessa with a fury that was almost a human plea. He had not expected a woman who served to be the instrument of his undoing. "Who are you?" he demanded, as if you could reduce someone to a single answer. Vanessa let the silence answer. She had been many things, unnamed, small, necessary. Now she was visible in a way she'd not asked for, and in a way that felt like an iron ring of accountability. "I am the person who listened," she said. "I kept what you threw away." There were arrests, harsh, legal, and recorded. The police moved with a tempo that was not cinematic, but effective. There was no movie-style vengeance. Men were photographed, read their rights, led away with their shoulders squared. Corvino did not go quietly into a cell as some dramatics might demand. He went with the clumsy human rage of a man whose world was being refiled. After the arrest, the city felt quieter, but not healed. Law is not a broom that sweeps clean a street. It is a process that removes the rot with exposure and then leaves the building to be renovated slowly. Vanessa watched Corvino's men led away and felt a strange oddness, some relief, some absence, and an ache that lingering problems could not be solved in one night. The case moved through courts with a litany of hearings. Elena used the evidence Vanessa had gathered to exact subpoenas and secure extraditions for funds moved abroad. The shipping manifests connected to the series of transfers Vanessa had mapped. Witnesses entered the legal protection system, housed, counseled, their testimonies checked and backed by the paper Vanessa had lugged for years. Some survivors agreed to testify publicly, others settled into the long, quiet work of being safe. The city held its breath as the little machinery of accountability, slow and bureaucratic, got to work. In the middle of the legal machinery, Vanessa kept a vigil of her own. She made sure the women she had helped had access to counselors, to safe apartments, to education funds Rosa had touched with small private checks. Marco found ways to move resources legally into programs that would keep children out of markets and women from being compelled into dark work because of debt. The Matriarch, who had a lifetime of being a chief among those who resolved wrongs by other means, found herself changed in the slow glow of justice. She watched the men she had once tolerated be taken by other men in dark uniforms with clipboards. The family world she had honed on loyalty now had to reconcile itself with a world where law could be seen as a partner. It was a strange kind of humility, and Rosa accepted it the way a weathered captain accepts a tide, with the reluctance of someone who knows the danger and the necessity. One afternoon, the evidence that had been kept in Vanessa's apartment, the ledger, the notes, the faded threads, moved from private drawers into legal hands. Elena turned to Vanessa and, with a careful hand, put a folder in front of her. "You did this," Elena said. "Not the state, not the family. You stitched together a case from things people didn't want you to have." "People told me their names," Vanessa replied. She did not try to claim the credit alone. "They trusted me with pieces because no one else would listen in the ways needed." Elena folded the folder back to Vanessa like a returned favor. "You ever want to bring this work to a place where it's not just a one-off? Come find me," she said. "We need people who know how to make the invisible seen." It was an offer of a different sort, one that did not hinge on family loyalty or the compromise of old codes. Vanessa felt the weight of it like a hand on her shoulder. It was an invitation into an institution that could mean more work, but also a different kind of impact. She carried the memory of the market child, the driver who had died, the hush of survivors' confessions. Her heart wanted the law to be better than it was. The matriarch Rosa also watched and wondered. She had offered Vanessa a seat the night of the safe apartment, a role inside the family that would be equal parts protection and leverage. Now the family had changed. The old accommodations of power were not bright enough to hold the new world Vanessa was building. Rosa understood that power could be used for charity or for extortion. She had made choices in her life that made certain things necessary. Now she needed to know what Vanessa wanted. One evening, After a hearing that had moved one of the mid-level men from Corvino's ring closer to conviction, Rosa asked Vanessa to walk with her along the harbor. The light was the color of old coins, and the ships rolled gently at their moorings. "You stitched us into this," Rosa said quietly. "Not because we are innocent, but because you thought people should not be sold like things. You could join us and change us from inside, or you could leave and make things from the outside. Which will you choose?" Vanessa looked at the water and for a moment let the harbor answer for her with its steady pull. "Inside," she said, but it was a complicated word. She did not mean inside the family as a daughter or pawn. She meant a new kind of inside, one that took the reach of the family and used it to shield rather than to hide. Rosa smiled a small, wry smile. "Make conditions," she urged. "If you only come into our house to make it harder to look at things we've done, you will be punished in ways I prefer not to think of. By my rivals and by my old habits. But if you come with terms, clear ones, and if you accept some of our resources for the right work, then we can seat you where you can make changes." They forged an agreement that read like the marriage of two incompatible logics, the family's reach and Vanessa's commitment to legal transparency. It allowed Vanessa a title that meant access, head of protective intelligence, an officer role within the family business aimed at keeping the family from being used as a cover for trafficking or financial crimes. It came with the power to audit operations and to refuse business that smudged into exploitation. It came with a caveat. Rosa would stand as guarantor that Vanessa's people would be supported if they came forward, and that the family's resources would be used to fund relocation and programs for survivors. Vanessa negotiated fiercely. She would not accept secrecy for the sake of the family's reputation. She demanded clauses that ensured independent oversight. Elena agreed to serve as a non-family legal check and an NGO with international reach. Citizens of justice who had tracked trafficking routes for years would be given access to audit the results of any family internal investigations. Rosa, with the stubbornness of a woman who had been carved by storms, accepted the terms because she had been graced with a kind of clarity. If the family wanted to stay in business, it had to stop feeding on the lives of people under pretense. "You will have enemies," Rosa warned when the papers were initialed. "There are men who will not take kindly to rules when they were used to being the rules." Vanessa lifted her chin. The harbor sounded like a city counting to 10. "Then we count carefully," she said. "And we make sure the counting is done by people who cannot be bought." The months that followed were not a tidy tale of justice instantly rewarding everyone. Courts moved slowly. Some men were acquitted by astute defense arguments, some slipped away, and some attempted to strike at the edges of the family's new posture, but the scale of damage was curtailed. A network unraveled in threads as witnesses testified under the protection secured by the combination of family funds and Elena's legal reach. Survivors who had once been anonymous were given shelter, training, and a faint, stubborn hope. Vanessa found herself in a liminal place. She carried the apron for the nights she still worked in service sometimes, but she also sat at long, well-lit tables with lawyers and social workers drafting protocols for how the family would interface with the rights of survivors. She created privacy networks for testimony, set up funds that were legally transparent, and oversaw audits of the docs. She acted as a translator between worlds that had rarely spoken civilly. Sometimes she thought of the man who had stitched the pattern into her apron. She imagined that he would have liked the idea that a stitch could become a bridge. Rosa brought her small dishes, the old kitchen food that had threaded the first scene, and Vanessa ate them with the awareness of someone who had learned to read a map, not just in ink, but in flavor. There were bumps. Old men in the family who had seen exploits as a currency complained. They wanted quicker profit, not cautious accountability. Some resisted in private, but the house had the matriarch's iron, and Rosa used it sparingly, with the authority of someone who understood the cost of both patience and force. People started to ask Vanessa who she was. Staff members would find her at odd hours knitting together spreadsheets and a list of safe houses. She had become a translator and a guardian. The city's sleepy corners, where she had once moved invisibly, had turned into places she could make visible for safety and then hide again for strategy. Her anonymity had been traded for a kind of agency. One night, after a long day that mixed courtroom testimony with the business of family dinners, Vanessa found herself standing in a kitchen she had once worked in. The light overhead hummed. A young woman, a survivor, sat at a table and watched Vanessa with careful curiosity. Vanessa made a cup of tea and sat down. "You don't look like anyone who belongs to either of them," the young woman said. You look like someone who belongs to herself." Vanessa lifted a shoulder. "Belonging changes," she said. "You can belong to a thing and still hold a space outside of it." The woman smiled, slow and then quicker as if finding footing. "Does that feel like a life?" "Some nights it's a life of small things," Vanessa said. "Of paying a rent, making sure a child gets school books, of showing up. Other nights it's a life of danger. But there's also this, a reason why someone would sit with you and ask what you need and then knock on doors until they open." The woman looked at Vanessa as if assessing a map. "And the matriarch? Does she like you now?" "For the right reasons," Vanessa said. "She likes what I do because it serves the house and because it keeps people alive. It doesn't mean I'm entirely safe from everyone, but I'm safer than I was." Vanessa had wanted for years to be seen. She had not known if the sight would be a gift or a chain. The offer from the family and her bargain with law had created a middle road. She had chosen to stand there, to keep her apron stained with food and her hands in the shape of service, even as she used that platform to make the city less hungry. The city did not flip overnight. There were men who attempted to repair losses with violence and who tried to buy outs. There were hearings that stretched like taut wire. But there were also mornings when a mother enrolled her child in a school that had once been a corridor of debt, and afternoons when a woman in the safe house laughed hard enough that the sound echoed like a promise. The matriarch sat one evening at the head of a table, not as a queen waiting to be bowed to, but as a woman who had learned to invite hands. She cleared a space for Vanessa and pushed a small plate of citrus forward, a circle of orange slices with a bitter smear of caper paste. It was neither a feast nor a truce. It was a covenant in food. "You spoke our language," Rosa said softly, the words almost private. "You gave us a way to see our own house without the curtains. You stitched a seam that we didn't know needed mending." Vanessa accepted the plate. The bite was a bright, sharp thing that made saliva quicken and cheeks clamp. In the citrus she found 1,000 small kitchens, the market, the bodega above which she'd once slept, the hands that had fed her and left without names. Food had been a bridge for her since she had been a child, and tonight it was an old map. "Do you regret it?" Rosa asked. "This turning of our house toward daylight?" Vanessa considered the question. Regret is a heavy thing and also a useful teacher. She thought of the people who had been saved, of those who still needed shelter, of the ledger full of names never to be rewritten. "I regret the things that had to happen to make it necessary," Vanessa said finally. "I regret that people were sold, that some paid with their lives, but I don't regret turning the light on." Rosa's fingers found Vanessa's hand across the table and squeezed with an odd tenderness. The gesture felt like a rewriting of belonging, a handshake between an old power and a new kind of work. There were offers after. The city, after the case, offered Vanessa a public role within an initiative to monitor trafficking routes. Elena called and suggested a formal consultative place with the prosecutor's office. It was tempting. It was important work. Yet Vanessa knew herself in the dark as well as in the light. She knew the cost of leaving the streets she had grown in for offices and suits. She wanted to be both in the law's inner rooms and still on the ground when someone needed a shirt or a ride in the middle of the night. In the end, she accepted a hybrid. She would take the family's resources and Elena's channels to launch an independent unit, a nonprofit with legal backing and family-funded programs to rehouse families, fund legal advocacy, and create a hotline that was not easily silenced. The family would underwrite it for the first years, with public audits overseen by Elena's office and an international NGO. Vanessa would be the director. She would also retain a position inside the family's protective structure, so she could audit operations and refuse any business that risked exploitation. It was a compromise, but it was one she had chosen. The inauguration of the nonprofit was a small affair. The matriarch and Marco in attendance, Elena with a respectful nod, a handful of survivors, and the quiet murmur of people who had been in the room from the beginning. Vanessa spoke for a few minutes. She did not grandstand. She talked about safety and evidence and the long days of listening. She spoke of a city that could be more than a ledger of victims. Afterwards, Rosa took Vanessa aside and produced a small parcel wrapped in cloth. "You will not keep this as a secret," she said. "You will keep it as a reminder." Inside was a pendant of mother of pearl, simple and quiet, the same kind of thing Rosa wore. It matched the one the matriarch had fingered on the night Vanessa had first spoken the old word. Vanessa turned it over in her hand and found in it the scent of lemon and the salt of longboats. It meant nothing to those who only counted coin, but it was everything to a woman who had been stitched into a seam. "You are offered a seat," Rosa said. "Not as a subject, not as an acquisition, as a voice within a structure that will now be watched. Vanessa put the pendant around her neck. It lay low against her collarbone like a token and a burden. She felt the weight of it the way a person feels a compass, not directive but clarifying. Days later, she found herself back in the club, Lido Nero, accepting a tray from a younger server with a smile that acknowledged the night and its work. People looked at her with something like curiosity. In the weeks following the arrests, many had adjusted their lives. The docks were quieter in certain ways. The night had less of the furtive air that made bodies into inventory. Change here was uneven, but visible. One evening, after locking up the nonprofit office and sending the emails that kept an entire small machine moving, Vanessa walked to the harbor. The city shimmered with lights. The reflection of the pendant glinted in the black water. For a long while she stood there, feeling the tide press and pull at her decisions. Belonging had never been a single room where you go to take a chair. It was a long table that required negotiation, courage, and the willingness to be seen in a world that rewarded invisibility. Vanessa had asked for sight and been given a hand that could move the curtain. She had traded secrecy for a public cause, and for the shelter of a family that had once been complicit and now risked being accountable. She thought of the stitch again, the small mark sewn into the fabric of her life by someone who had taught her how to hide things in hems. The stitch had been a secret vestige. Now it served as a map. People found their way by thread and testimony. Vanessa had become both seamstress and mapmaker, and she had chosen to make the city safer by holding both the needle and the proof. As she turned away from the water, someone called her name. A woman she had helped, now working at a daytime shelter, who raised a hand in a greeting that had no need to be small. Vanessa returned the wave and felt the familiar steadiness of being not invisible, but useful. There would be more storms, more hearings, more men who tried to find where light bent and glare could be avoided. There would be places where justice was slow, and the work of protection required repetition rather than heroics. But the arc had shifted in a way that mattered. A family had learned a kind of humility. The law had found an ally who would not be distracted by the city's glitter. Survivors who had once been passed through hands now had paths that led away. On the first anniversary of the raid that had brought Corvino to the docks in handcuffs, they held a small remembrance. They did not call it a celebration. Too many lives had been harmed for that. But they called it a reckoning. Survivors told their stories, not as entertainment, but as fact. Elena spoke of the law's limits and its possibilities. Rosa offered food and a short, quiet toast to those who had finally been seen. Vanessa listened to their voices and thought of the room where an old woman had recognized her by a phrase that belonged to an island nobody else had ever bothered to learn. Language had been the key that day. It had opened the door. From that small opening came a long series of changes. The pendant Rosa had given her rested warm against her chest, a small tide against the steady beat she had learned to trust. At the event's close, Rosa stood and raised her cane in a way that was not a command but a benediction. The room fell into the kind of hush that honors rather than anticipates. She looked at Vanessa and, in front of everyone, offered a short, simple thing. "You are of the house now," she said, "but you will never be owned by it." Vanessa felt the words like a weather change. It was a promise and a freedom. She understood that sitting at a table could mean obligations and compromises. It could also mean the ability to change systems from within. Her choice had been visible and dangerous and right. She had turned the ledger into a weapon for the weak. Evidence, law, shelter. She had taken the hurt of being invisible and turned it into a strategy for seeing those who had been kept from view. As guests filed out into the harbor night, Vanessa lingered by the window, watching light slice the water into silver. She found a small card on the table with a handwritten number and a phrase. "If you ever need help looking, call." It was Elena's slow humor. She smiled, pocketed the card, and for the first time in a long stretch of nights, let herself stand in the light without counting the cost. The pendant at her throat warmed again, as if echoing the harbor. She had been the woman who served. She had become the woman who kept service from becoming a cover for harm. The city continued to turn, businessmen with business to do, sailors with anchors to lift. But somewhere in the ledger of its nights, the entries had shifted. Names once traded as inventory found the dignity of record. Small hands worked to stitch survivors into lives that were their own. Vanessa watched the lights and thought of the sea and of a matriarch who had recognized a voice and, by doing so, forced a whole city's attention to a seam. In the end, when she sat at both tables, the families and the nonprofits, Vanessa could hear the echo of the first word that had stopped a room. It was not a miracle, it was an act of remembering. It had remembered a language, a name, a stitch, and in remembering it had made the invisible visible enough to be held accountable. There was more to do. There always would be. But for now the harbor breathed and the city counted its losses and its tiny victories. Vanessa straightened the pendant beneath her collar, set her shoulders to the night, and walked back into the rooms she once crossed as a ghost. This time as a woman who had been found and had chosen, deliberately, to remain. If this story spoke to you, there are more like it. Tales of people who move through the shadows so others can live in the light.